You were never a daughter, Claire. You were just a high-yield investment that we decided to cash out today. My father said those words into the microphone at his 30th anniversary party, handing the keys to my house to my sister Sarah. I am Claire Bennett. At 32, I realized my parents didn't love me, they appraised me. I didn't scream. I just held the blue ledger tighter. Like and subscribe only if you believe family shouldn't be a business. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let go back 10 years. The scent of expensive lilies and stale champagne from the party still clings to my skin, but as I close my eyes, I am transported back 16 years. I was 16 and Sarah was 18. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and heavy with the threat of rain. We were in the backyard of our old house in suburban Illinois. There was a loose stone on the retaining wall, something my father Robert had promised to fix for months. We were arguing. I do not even remember what about. Probably something small, like a borrowed sweater or a snide comment she made about my grades. I remember Sarah reaching out to push me, but her foot slipped on that loose stone. I reached for her. I swear to this day that I reached for her to save her. But in the chaos of gravity and screaming, we both went down. I landed on the grass. Sarah landed on the concrete path, her leg twisting at an angle that still makes my stomach churn when I think about it. The doctors said it was a complicated fracture. They spoke about nerve damage and a lifelong limp. But it was my parents who delivered the real sentence. My mother Martha stood over my bed that night, her face a mask of cold disappointment. She told me that I had destroyed my sister's chances at a dance scholarship. She told me that Sarah's pain was my shadow, and I would have to walk in it until the debt was paid. That was the night the blue ledger appeared. My father sat me down at the kitchen table the day I turned 17. He opened a small leather-bound notebook with blue covers. On the first page he had written my name in his precise architectural script. Below it he had listed every expense from Sarah's surgery that insurance did not cover. $8,422. Family takes care of family, Claire, he told me, his voice as dry as parchment. But balance must be maintained. You took something from Sarah. Now you will give back until the scales are even. I believed him. At 17, you believe your parents are the ultimate moral authority. I spent my senior year of high school working 30 hours a week at a local diner, flipping burgers until my hair smelled like old grease. Every Friday I handed my paycheck to my father. He would open the blue ledger, subtract my contribution, and then, this was the part that felt like a cold needle in my heart, he would add interest. He called it a management fee for the family fund. By the time I graduated college, which I paid for myself through 3 jobs and 0 sleep, the ledger had grown. It was no longer just about the accident. It was for the rent I owed them for my childhood bedroom. It was for the groceries I consumed before I was old enough to work. It was a map of my life, translated into a language of debt. 10 years ago, when I was 22 and landed my first real job in logistics, my father came to me with a proposal. He looked older, his hair thinning, his eyes more predatory. He told me that the family needed security. He suggested we buy a house together. A grand 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet cul-de-sac. We will put our names on the title for now to secure the financing, he had said, leaning back in his worn recliner. You pay the mortgage, Claire. It is your way of building equity for your future, and a way to provide a roof for the sister you crippled. Once the house is paid off, or when you are ready to marry, we will transition the deed to include you. It is a shared investment. I saw it as a chance for redemption. I thought that if I could provide a mansion for the people I had hurt, the blue ledger would finally be closed. I signed the papers. I did not hire my own lawyer because you are supposed to trust your father when he says he is protecting you. For 10 years I lived in the smallest bedroom of that house. I watched as Sarah took the master suite because her phantom leg pain required more space for therapeutic equipment she never used. I watched as my mother decorated the halls with expensive silk wallpaper and crystal chandeliers, all charged to the credit card I paid off every month. Every single month for 120 months I wrote a check for $3,215. I watched my bank account drain while Sarah spent her days shopping online, claiming she was too fragile for a 9-to-5 job. I became the ghost of the household. I left for work at 6 in the morning and returned at 8 at night. I ate my dinner alone in the kitchen while they laughed in the dining room. I was not a daughter. I was a tenant who paid for the privilege of being ignored. The micro twist, the one I did not see until it was too late, was the way my father smiled whenever I handed him the check. It was not a smile of gratitude. It was the smile of a man who had found a way to make a human being into a recurring revenue stream. But I kept my own records. Hidden beneath the loose floorboard in my tiny bedroom was my own version of the truth. I tracked every cent. I saved every receipt. I was waiting for the day the mortgage would be finished. I was waiting for the day the blue ledger would hit zero, and I could finally breathe. I thought that day was today, at their 30-year anniversary party. I thought we were celebrating the end of a long journey. I had even bought a bottle of vintage wine, thinking we would toast to our shared home. Then my father stood up. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon, the sound ringing through the crowded ballroom like a funeral bell. He looked at Sarah, who was wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, and then he looked at me. His eyes were as flat as coins. Today, he announced to the room, we celebrate legacy. We celebrate the fact that Sarah will never have to worry about a roof over her head again. Martha and I are officially gifting the deed of the Bennett estate to our eldest daughter Sarah as her early inheritance and wedding gift. The room erupted in applause. My aunt sobbed into a lace handkerchief. Sarah hugged my father, her limp miraculously absent as she leaped into his arms. I sat there, my hand frozen on the handle of my purse. Inside that purse was the blue ledger. I had stolen it from my father's study an hour before the party. And as I turned the pages in the dim light under the table, I saw a note in the margin from 5 years ago. It was a copy of an insurance settlement. A settlement for $50,000 paid out to my parents for Sarah's accident 3 months after it happened. The uncovered medical bills had never existed. The debt was a lie. The house was a trap. And the woman sitting next to me was not a victim. The applause at the party felt like physical blows, each clap a nail in the coffin of the life I thought I was building. I did not stand up. I did not shout. I sat there with the blue ledger heavy in my lap, feeling the texture of the leather beneath my trembling fingers. I looked at my mother. She was beaming, her eyes bright with a predatory kind of joy as she watched Sarah play the role of the blushing heiress. My father caught my eye for a split second. He didn't look guilty. He looked satisfied, like a man who had successfully moved a difficult piece of inventory. I stayed until the very end. I helped stack the rented chairs. I gathered the discarded napkins. I played the part of the dutiful invisible daughter because silence is the best camouflage for a predator. When we finally returned to the house that was no longer mine even in theory, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thinner, colder. "Claire, honey," Sarah said as she kicked off her designer heels in the foyer. She didn't limp, not even a stumble. "We need to talk about the guest room. I'm thinking of turning it into a walk-in closet for my wedding wardrobe. You understand, don't you? Since the house is in my name now, we need to make some executive decisions." I looked at her. Her face was smooth, unburdened by the 10 years of labor I had poured into those walls. "Of course, Sarah," I said, my voice as flat as a frozen lake. "I understand perfectly." I went to my room, the smallest room, the one with the drafty window, and I locked the door. I didn't cry. I didn't have the luxury of tears. Instead, I opened my laptop. My job in logistics is all about tracking movement, identifying bottlenecks, and following the paper trail until every pallet is accounted for. I began to apply that same cold logic to my own life. I spent the next 3 days living like a ghost in my own home. I watched Sarah and my mother pore over interior design magazines, talking about ripping out the hardwood floors I had paid to refinish 2 summers ago. They spoke as if I weren't in the room, as if I were just another piece of furniture they were planning to donate to charity. But at night, while the house slept, I worked. I had the blue ledger, but I needed more. I needed the primary sources. I knew my father kept his archives in the basement, behind a row of old tax preparation folders. He was a man of habit, a man who believed his own lies so thoroughly that he kept the evidence as trophies of his cleverness. On the 3rd night I found it. It was a dusty accordion file labeled Medical Sarah. I expected to see years of physical therapy bills, specialist consultations, and pharmacy receipts. Instead, I found a single discharge summary from 16 years ago. It stated in plain clinical English that Sarah Bennett had suffered a grade 2 ankle sprain and a hairline fracture that would heal completely within 8 weeks. There was no nerve damage, there was no permanent disability. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the basement, the paper shaking in my hand. For 16 years I had carried the weight of a handicap that didn't exist. I had skipped proms, worked double shifts, and lived in a state of perpetual apology for a sprain. The pressure inside my chest was reaching a breaking point. I felt like a boiler with a jammed valve. Every thank you for the mortgage payment and every poor Sarah can't work today flashed through my mind like a montage of a heist. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my youth. They had used my own conscience as a weapon against me. Before I tell you about the secret I found in Sarah's gym bag, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the one who sacrificed everything, only to realize you were being used by the people who were supposed to protect you? If you know that feeling of being invisible in your own family, like and subscribe to let me know I'm not alone in this. The next morning, Sarah left for what she called a medical consultation. She left her gym bag near the front door. It was an expensive branded bag, the kind people use when they want to be seen at high-end athletic clubs. I knew I shouldn't look, but the Claire who followed the rules had died at that anniversary party. Inside the bag, I found a pair of worn-out running shoes. Not walking shoes, not orthopedic inserts. Running shoes with the tread smoothed down from miles of use. I also found a membership card for a high-intensity interval training studio 3 towns over under a different name. Sarah Miller. My sister wasn't just walking fine. She was a regular at a boutique fitness studio while I was paying for her therapeutic massages. The surface emotion I showed them at dinner that night was one of weary acceptance. I even offered to help Sarah pick out the new paint for my room-turned-closet. But beneath that there was a hidden current of absolute crystalline rage. I wasn't just going to leave, I was going to audit them. I spent the rest of the week calculating the total. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every emergency medical expense for a fake limp. When I added it all up, the number was staggering. $385,640. That was the price of my sister lie. That was the cost of my parents' betrayal. I realized then that my father's blue ledger was more than a list of debts. It was a confession. He had documented his own fraud for 16 years, thinking I would never be brave enough to read it with my eyes open. "Are you okay, Claire?" my mother asked as she walked into the kitchen, smelling of expensive perfume I had bought her for Christmas. "You've been so quiet lately. Are you still upset about the house? You know we love you, but Sarah needs more help than you do. You're the strong one." "I'm fine, Mom," I said, smiling at her for the first time in days. It was the smile of a woman who had just found the master key to a locked door. "I'm just finishing my books. I want to make sure everything is balanced before I move out." "That my girl," she said, patting my cheek. "Always so responsible." She had no idea that my responsibility was no longer to them. My responsibility was now to the truth. And the truth was about to become very expensive for the Bennett family. The next morning I did something I had never done in 10 years of employment. I called in sick. I sat in my car 3 blocks away from the house and watched my father drive off to his golf club and my mother head to her bridge club. I waited until Sarah's car, the one I had paid the insurance on for 3 years, pulled out of the driveway. Only then did I return to the house that felt like a crime scene. I went straight to my father's home office. He called it his sanctuary, a place where the women of the house were rarely invited. It smelled of old leather and the expensive cigars he smoked while I was eating generic brand cereal to save money. I sat in his chair, feeling the weight of the blue ledger in my lap. I began to cross-reference his handwritten notes with the digital records on his computer. I am a logistics coordinator. My entire life is built on finding the discrepancies between what is promised and what is delivered. I started with the mortgage. I logged into the bank portal using the password I had seen him type a dozen times over his shoulder. I expected to see a shared account. Instead, I found a black hole. The house was not just in their names. It had been refinanced 3 times in the last 5 years. Each time my father had taken out equity to pay for what he labeled family expenses. I scrolled through the line items. $12,000 for Sarah's European vacation, $18,000 for my mother's kitchen remodel, $24,000 for a country club membership. And then, I saw the name on the second mortgage, Claire Bennett. My heart didn't just drop, it turned to ice. He hadn't just used my monthly checks to pay for the house. He had forged my signature on loan documents. He had stolen my credit, my identity, and my future to fund a lifestyle for 3 people who viewed me as a utility bill. The total debt attached to my name, without my knowledge, was $214,560. I leaned back in his chair, the room spinning. I wasn't just a daughter who had been cheated out of an inheritance. I was a victim of a coordinated long-term financial assault. They hadn't just taken my past, they had mortgaged my next 30 years. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who still have something to lose. I had already lost everything. I took out my phone and began photographing every document, every forged signature, every line in the blue ledger that showed him charging me interest on money he was simultaneously stealing from my credit line. I called Marcus Thorne, an attorney I had worked with on international shipping contracts. He was a man who spoke in cold, hard facts. He didn't offer sympathy, and that was exactly why I needed him. "Claire," he said after I spent 20 minutes explaining the situation and emailing him the photos, "this isn't just a family dispute. This is a breach of fiduciary duty and multiple counts of identity theft. If you press charges, your father could face significant prison time. But you have to be sure, once we start this, there is no going back to Sunday dinners." "There never were any Sunday dinners, Marcus," I said, looking at a framed photo on the desk of my parents and Sarah at the beach. I wasn't in the photo. I was the one who had taken it. There was only a transaction, and today, the payment stopped. The turn happened that Friday. It was the first of the month. For 10 years, the first of the month was the day I handed my father a check for $3,215. We were sitting in the living room. Sarah was showing my mother swatches of velvet for the new curtains in my room. The air was thick with the scent of lavender candles. "Claire, dear," my father said, not even looking up from his newspaper. "It the first. Don't forget the household contribution. With the wedding coming up, Sarah is going to need some extra liquidity for the florist deposit. I stood in the doorway, my hands empty. I didn't write the check, Dad. The room went silent. The only sound was the clicking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My mother stopped petting the velvet swatch. Sarah looked up, a fake concerned pout on her lips. Are you short this month, honey? My mother asked, her voice laced with a subtle, sharp edge. We can take it out of your savings, but you'll have to pay it back with interest. You know how your father feels about the balance. I'm not short, I said. My voice sounded different, lower, steadier. I'm just done. I've looked at the books, Dad. All of them. The blue ledger, the mortgage statements, and the loan documents you signed in my name. My father's face didn't crumble. It hardened. He folded his newspaper with terrifying precision. I don't know what you think you saw, Claire, but you have no right to go through my private papers. Everything I did for this family. To keep this roof over our heads. To keep the roof over Sarah's head, I corrected him. And you did it by stealing from me. $214,000 in unauthorized loans. That is the end of the conversation, Dad. I've already moved my bank accounts, I've frozen my credit, and I've hired Marcus Thorne. The name Thorne made him flinch. He knew the name. Everyone in the local business community knew that name. You would sue your own father. Sarah gasped, her voice shrill. After everything they've done for you? After they kept you after you crippled me? I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see a sister. I saw a parasite. You were never crippled, Sarah. I saw the records from 16 years ago. A sprain. I saw your gym bag. I know about Sarah Miller and the high-intensity interval training. The only thing you're crippled by is your own laziness. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a devastating storm. My mother's face was white. My father's knuckles were bone-colored as he gripped the armrests of his chair. You have 24 hours to figure out how you're going to pay off those loans, I said, turning to leave. Because if that debt isn't removed from my name by Monday morning, I'm taking everything to the district attorney. You're heartless, my mother whispered. No, Mom, I said, pausing at the stairs. I'm just finally balanced. The 24 hours passed like a slow-motion car crash. I spent the night in a hotel, the first night in 10 years I didn't sleep under the roof I was paying for. It was a cheap room near the interstate, smelling of lemon bleach and old carpets, but I had never felt more at peace. I kept the blue ledger on the nightstand next to my phone. Every time I felt a flicker of the old guilt, that conditioned reflex that told me I was a bad daughter, I looked at the forged signatures on my laptop screen. When I returned to the house the next evening, the lights were all on. It looked like a postcard of a happy family home, glowing warm and inviting in the twilight. But as I stepped through the front door, the illusion shattered. They were waiting for me in the living room. It was a staged intervention. My mother was sitting on the sofa, a damp tissue clutched in her hand, her eyes red from what I assumed was a very rehearsed bout of crying. My father was standing by the fireplace, trying to look like a patriarch, though his shoulders were slumped in a way I had never seen before. Sarah was there too, sitting in my chair, her face twisted into a mask of pure spite. Claire, my father began, his voice booming with a false authority. We've had a long talk. We've decided to forgive you for your outburst yesterday. We understand you're under a lot of stress with work. We're willing to move past this if you apologize and sign these papers. He held out a thick envelope. I didn't take it. What papers, Dad? A non-disclosure agreement, he said, his eyes narrowing, and a formal acknowledgement that the money you've provided over the years was a voluntary gift to the family. In exchange, we won't press charges for the documents you stole from my private files. I almost laughed. The sheer audacity of a man who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars threatening to press charges for theft of paper was the final proof I needed. They didn't see me as a person. I was just a failing asset they were trying to liquidate. No, I said, my voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Here's what is going to happen. Marcus Thorne sent a process server to your office 5 minutes ago, Dad. Since it's after hours, he'll be waiting for you tomorrow morning. It'll list pendants, a notice of pending litigation on this house. You can't gift the deed to Sarah, and you can't sell it. The title is frozen until a court determines how much of this equity belongs to me. My mother let out a sharp, choked sob. Claire, you're destroying us. This is your sister's wedding gift. How could you be so selfish? Selfish. I stepped toward her, and for the first time in my life she was the one who flinched. I have paid every cent for this roof for 10 years. I have paid for the food in that refrigerator and the silk on these walls. Sarah, tell me about your fiancé. Tell me about the wedding you need this house for. Sarah turned her head away, her jaw tightening. I did some more digging last night, I continued, looking directly at my sister. I called the athletic club where you train as Sarah Miller. It turns out you've been dating the head trainer there for 2 years. His name is Jason. I called him this morning. He was very confused when I mentioned a wedding. He said you told him you lived in a guest house owned by your elderly, eccentric parents who needed constant care. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it would crack the floorboards. Sarah's face turned a violent shade of purple. My father looked at her, his brows furrowed in genuine confusion. Sarah, my father whispered. What is she talking about? You told us you were engaged to that lawyer from Chicago. You said he needed a high-status home to impress his partners. There is no lawyer from Chicago, Dad, I said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. She made him up to trigger the early inheritance. She wanted the house in her name so she could sell it, take the money and move to California with her trainer. She wasn't just playing me, she was playing you too. Sarah leaped to her feet, her limp completely forgotten. She didn't stumble, she didn't wince. She stormed across the room until she was inches from my face. So what if I did? She hissed, her voice dripping with a venom I had never heard before. You owe me, Claire. You got to have a career, you got to have a life. I had to stay here and be the daughter they actually liked. You think it was easy, pretending to be grateful for your scraps while you acted like a martyr? You're a cold, boring little bookkeeper and nobody loves you. They only tolerated you because of the checks. It was the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to me, and yet it didn't hurt. It felt like a final cold splash of water that woke me up from a 20-year nightmare. I know, I said softly, and that's why the checks are never coming back. My father moved toward me, his hand raised as if he were going to strike me, but he stopped when he saw me pull out my phone. I'm recording this, Dad, I said, and Marcus is on the other end of a live stream. If you touch me, the police will be here in 3 minutes. Now you have a choice. You can let the lawsuit go to trial. I will expose the insurance fraud from 16 years ago. I will expose the identity theft. You will lose the house, your reputation, and likely your freedom. Or you can sign the house over to me. Entirely. In exchange, I will pay off the loans you took in my name and give you and Mom 60 days to find a small apartment. I'll even give you a small monthly allowance from the equity on the condition that you never ever contact me again. You would kick your parents out of their home, my mother wailed, throwing her head back in a theatrical display of grief. It was never your home, Mom, I said, turning toward the door. It was my prison, and today I'm the one with the keys. I walked over to the small coffee table where the blue ledger lay. I picked up a pen from my mother's desk. I opened the book to the very last page, where my father had calculated my debt for the month. I drew a thick black line through the total. Below it I wrote, paid in full. I threw the book onto the sofa. I'll have the paperwork delivered tomorrow, don't bother calling. My number is already changed. As I walked out of that house for the last time as a victim, I heard Sarah screaming at my parents, and my mother's wails echoing through the foyer. It was the sound of a dynasty of lies finally collapsing under its own weight. I sat in my car and gripped the steering wheel. My knuckles were white, but my heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. I was 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone anything. The silence of the house was the first thing I noticed after they left. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets and unsaid resentment. It was a clean silence. It was the sound of a fever finally breaking. 60 days after that final confrontation, the colonial was empty. I had watched from the kitchen window as the movers hauled away the velvet sofas, the crystal chandeliers, and the silk rugs, all the things I had paid for but never felt entitled to touch. My mother had tried to take the built-in bookshelves, claiming they were family heirlooms, until Marcus Thorne reminded her lawyer that anything attached to the walls belonged to the owner of the deed. My father didn't look at me when he walked out the door for the last time. He carried a single box of his tax records and his golf clubs. He looked small. For 20 years I had seen him as a giant, a master of fate who held the scales of my worth in his hands. But as he shuffled toward his car, I realized he was just a man who had traded his daughter's love for a high-yield interest rate. It was a bad trade. My mother stopped at the threshold. She looked at me with eyes that were still searching for a way to make me feel guilty. I hope you're happy, Claire, she whispered, living in this big house all by yourself. I hope the walls keep you warm at night. The walls don't have to keep me warm, Mom, I replied, leaning against the doorframe, because for the first time in my life, I'm not shivering in your shadow. Sarah didn't stay to help them move. The moment she realized the house was legally frozen, she vanished. I heard through an aunt that she moved to California with her trainer, but the relationship lasted less than 3 months. It turns out that when the heiress has no inheritance and a documented history of insurance fraud, she isn't quite as attractive to a man looking for a free ride. She sends me a message once a month, usually a link to a GoFundMe page or a long rambling email about how I stole her future. I don't block her. I just archive the emails without reading them. Silence isn't just a boundary, it is my new form of currency. I didn't stay in that house. It was a monument to a lie, and I didn't want to live inside a crime scene. I sold the property for $525,000. After paying off the fraudulent loans and the legal fees, I had more than enough to start over. I bought a small cottage 300 miles away, near a lake where the water is so clear you can see the stones on the bottom. It has 2 bedrooms, one for me, and one for the books I finally have time to read. There is no blue ledger here, there are no debts. On the 1-year anniversary of the party, I took the blue ledger down to the shore. I thought about burning it, but that felt too dramatic, too much like a scene from a movie. Instead, I sat on the dock and looked at the last page. I looked at the line I had drawn through the total. I realized that the debt was never about the money or the accident. It was about control. They had tried to bankrupt my soul so I would never realize I was the one holding all the capital. I tore the pages out, one by one. I watched the wind catch them and carry them across the water. They looked like small white birds for a moment before they hit the surface and sank. I am 33 years old now. I have a job I love, a home that smells of real cedar and fresh coffee, and a bank account that belongs only to me. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up and feel a phantom weight on my chest, a habit of 20 years of worry. But then I breathe in the cool lake air and remember, the scales are even, the books are closed. I am not a high-yield investment, and I am not a mistake to be paid for. I am just Claire. And that is more than enough. If this story meant something to you, or if you have ever felt like you were paying for a debt you didn't owe, leave your thoughts below. I want to hear your stories of finding your own way out. And please, subscribe if you believe that the truth is the only inheritance that matters. Thank you for staying with me until the end.